Hello, my name is Colton Hill, and I'm an Aviary Systems Specialist with Big Dutchman. And today in this presentation, we'll be sharing some tips to help you manage your aviary system. First, let's begin by looking at the topic of starting your chicks off right and some points to consider in assuring your birds do get off to that good start. You want to utilize a rearing system that mirrors the laying system. For example, interior and exterior perching utilized in the rearing barn needs to be the same size and design as the laying barn. From an early age, utilization of these perches creates good jumping behaviors, movement, and promotes good muscle development of that pullet. The placement of feed and water inside the system should be designed to promote movement inside, outside, and to all tiers of the aviary system. Next, in a cage-free setting, lighting needs to be uniform, dimmable, and designed to promote good bird distribution. You also want to have the ability to control any natural daylight that may come in your barn and negatively impact your flock. Lastly, aisle spacing needs to be considered because it directly affects lighting, ventilation, and the ability for your litter to dry. Having proper aisle spacing also gives the birds an adequate amount of space to practice their natural behaviors, which is important for a cage-free environment. Considering these factors makes the transition to laying barn much easier and is important for developing the behaviors and characteristics that are necessary to perform in a cage-free environment. Next, I would like to look at some key points in regards to how we train the birds to move back into the system during the sunset phase. With cage-free rearing, it is important to have multiple dimmable circuits of lights which are strategically dimmed to help draw that bird back into your system. We typically dim our system by first starting with the underneath circuit in a duration of 2 minutes. Next, we'll move to the aisle light circuit with a duration of 10 minutes. And lastly, we will dim our system lights in a duration of 25 to 30 minutes. These parameters are a good foundation to start your cage-free flock on, but do not be afraid to make minor adjustments to that aisle or system light circuit based on what you're seeing at night by the birds. Sometimes an increase or decrease on these circuits are necessary to produce the best movement back into that system. After lights have dimmed, physically place that bird back in the system. This is an important part of training that encourages movement back into the system. Typically, you will see half a reduction of birds you saw out the night before on the litter floor. By physically placing up birds will reduce the incidence of mortality due to piling, and also it ensures that birds wake up in the system with fresh feed and water that next light day. The utilization of ramps and bridges in cage-free rearing systems are needed to help train that bird to move in and out of the system during the light day and back into the system at night during the sunset phase. Depending on the system, we typically use these for 4 to 6 weeks after birds are released. After this time, you will want to gradually take these enrichments out because birds have learned to use the exterior perching to move in and out of the system. Lastly, the utilization of a stir feeding at sunset can be incorporated to help draw the birds back into the system at night. Typically, a 5 to 10 minute stir at the beginning of the dim cycle is what I found to be most effective. This practice simply grabs the bird's attention and encourages movement back into that system during the sunset phase. In any cage-free environment, whether it's a rearing barn or laying barn, walking your flock is one of the easiest, but yet most effective techniques one can practice. This is simply because we are encouraging birds to move, jump, and really utilize that system. The first walk should be when lights come on in the morning. This requires one to design a lighting schedule that allows you to be in the barn right when lights come on or very shortly after. You do not want to be in the barn hours after your lights come on because you simply do not know what's going on in your barn and you do not know what bad habits your birds may be forming. We recommend randomly walking your flock 5 to 6 times per day. This randomness will ensure that birds do not get used to being moved the same direction each way. And as you're walking that flock, try to walk in a way that promotes movement up into the system. And lastly, as you're walking your flock, be observant and pay close attention to the birds. For instance, watch bird behavior, observe bird movement, litter conditions, lighting, and look for any signs of aggression and take action if need be. Walking your flock often and collecting all mislays multiple times a day is an important measure that must be taken to control where your birds lay. Today, I would like to share some management practices to help you achieve low mislay percentages in your operation. Good management practices that are implemented at an early age in the laying barn ensures you can achieve this. For example, first you want to make sure birds are moving back into the system at night when they are first housed in the laying barn. If any birds are out in the litter aisle, make sure to place those birds back into the system because this could have an impact on the number of mislays you may encounter. We want to make sure that bird starts its next light day in the system. Once the birds are moved into the laying barn, the lifting of an interior nest curtain can be utilized to promote nest acceptance. This will also allow the hens to explore the nest more easily when they are first housed. As you're walking your flock collecting mislays, pay close attention to areas that could be subject to a higher number of mislaid eggs. Typically, these areas include sidewalls of your barn, underneath the system, and corners of your barn. Lastly, litter depth needs to be maintained at roughly 2 inches of depth to reduce the incidence of birds laying in these areas. A buildup of litter past this depth could encourage birds to nest in these areas. To name a few, considering and implementing these tips will help you achieve high nest acceptance with minimal amounts of mislaid eggs.
One of the most important areas to manage in a cage-free barn is the lighting. So let's take a look and go over some tips on lighting in a cage-free system. A breed management guide from your bird's genetic company should outline the intensity and the number of hours of on light a bird should have as they mature. An important task when training cage-free pullets is for them to go back into the system at night. The best tip I can give you for this is to be consistent with lighting duration and the time that the lighting begins. Colton already covered the duration part of this, but I want to add that if the birds are used to the lights dimming at, say, 7 p.m., try not to vary from this time. The birds develop a routine around this. If you alter the time, it confuses the birds and less go back into the system. Make sure you turn off the underneath lights first to move birds out from underneath the system. As you continue to watch this video of a sunset dim down, I want to cover some other lighting tips. When turning lights on in the morning, only a short sunrise period is needed, only about 2 to 5 minutes. Having a slower sunrise period can cause a higher number of mislaid eggs. Another tip is to use a light meter to measure your light intensity in multiple areas. Don't assume you know what the intensity is. Adjusting the lighting in the system and aisle can cause the birds to move around and from the system to the aisle. And what worked for the last flock may not work as well for your next flock, so remember to be willing to adjust for each flock. Dark areas can be hot spots for mislaid eggs, so trying to keep the nest the darkest area. Now, let's go over some tips to optimize the egg after it's laid. Ideally, the egg would be laid in the nest. You want the hens to want to go to the nest to lay. You can do this by providing an area that has some privacy with nest curtains. You also want the nest to be darker than other areas of the system. Make sure hens can't eat or drink from the nest area. They need a reason to leave the nest, or they might become protective of this area. Having a nest mat made of materials such as AstroTurf provides a soft landing for the egg. Nest ejection allows the eggs to roll out each night, making sure to get rid of any eggs laid that day. It can also help to make your nest cleaner. Having the nest to close each night also makes sure if the hens do not become protective of this area. Having a wide egg belt allows the eggs to transfer to their next destination without bumping into each other and being able to run a larger number of eggs at one time. That way, eggs are not piling back into the nest where eggs can be stepped on or kicked, reducing their quality. Eggs can then be transferred to conveyors to take them to packing or processing. Making these transitions smooth is important in reducing your number of checks and cracks. Now, let's talk about barn design. In cage-free, it's important to have aisles wide enough that both humans and birds can pass each other in the aisle safely. Also take into consideration the space that perches, ramps, and bridges will take up. Wider aisles also help with drying litter because the birds aren't as concentrated. Make sure you have enough waters, feeding space, and numbers of nests, and when possible, try to place your nests together. Another area to concentrate on is ventilation. Ventilation is very important and can cause birds to unwittingly migrate to different areas of the barn and to crowd. This can even cause mortality. Make sure your ventilation is easy to manage and is uniform throughout the barn. Lastly, we'll quickly go over feeding schedules and nutrition. It's important to set up a feeding schedule that doesn't disrupt the hen from laying in the nest or from going back into the system at night. Ideally, we would feed her 1 to 2 times in the morning prior to her peak laying period. Also, don't feed more than 1.5 hours prior to lights dimming. Another tip is to stay in contact with the nutritionist on setting up a ration for your cage-free flock. The requirements of a cage-free flock are different than that of a caged flock and need to be fed differently.